There is a moment, and you will never see it happen, because by the time it happens, you are already gone. When someone sits alone in a room that used to feel full, and the silence tells them something their pride would never let them say out loud. It is not a dramatic moment. No one screams. No one falls to their knees. It is quieter than that and crueler. It is the moment they reach for their phone to tell you something and remember mid-motion that you are no longer someone they get to tell things to. It is the moment they realize the door did not slam. It closed so softly they didn't hear it shut until they tried to open it again and found it locked from a side they no longer had a key to. This is a speech about that moment, about what happens in the deep unlit rooms of the psyche when a person finally understands what they had, precisely because it is no longer theirs to have. I want to begin not with comfort, but with truth, because comfort without truth is only a prettier kind of sleep, and I did not come here to lull you back into it. The truth is this: most people do not lose others through a single catastrophic act. They lose them the way a house loses heat, through 100 small, unlatched doors, left open out of habit, out of carelessness, out of the quiet arrogance of assuming the warmth will always be there. And the terrible thing about warmth is that you never notice it while you have it. You only notice the cold. So let us speak plainly about what happens inside a person, in that hidden chamber of the mind where the real business of living is conducted, far below the small talk and the daily performances. When they finally understand that you are gone and that this time you mean it, the first thing that happens is not grief. People assume grief arrives first because grief is the feeling we have names for, the one polite society allows us to display. But before grief there is disbelief, and disbelief is not an emotion, it is a defense. It is the mind's last desperate attempt to keep the old story alive a little longer, because as long as the story is alive, the self does not have to change. You will notice this in how they behave in the early hours and days after they understand what they've done. They will reach for the version of you that used to answer. They will draft the message and not send it, or send it and stare at the two gray ticks like a man staring at a locked door, certain that if he simply waits long enough, it will open the way it always has. This waiting is not patience. It is denial wearing patience's clothing, because somewhere beneath the waiting, a colder, more honest part of them already knows. It knew before the silence confirmed it. It has known, if we are honest, for longer than they will ever admit, because on some level, every person who loses someone worth having was warned, and chose, again and again, to look away from the warning. This is the part I want you to sit with, because it is the part most speeches about loss are too gentle to say. People do not usually lose the people who matter through ignorance. They lose them through a very specific and very human failure. the failure to look at what is right in front of them, because looking would require them to change, and change is the one thing the unguarded ego resists more than almost anything else. There is a reason the old stories are full of kings who lose their kingdoms not to invading armies, but to their own blindness, to counselors they refused to hear, to warnings they waved away, because acting on them would have meant admitting they were not as secure, as beloved, as permanent as they believed. You are not so different from those kings, and neither am I. We none of us like to believe that the people who love us have limits. We like to believe love is an infinite resource, that it will simply keep refilling itself no matter how carelessly we draw from the well. And then one day the bucket comes up dry, and we stand there astonished, as though the drought were not visible for months before it arrived. So the person who has lost you begins first in the room of disbelief, and slowly, sometimes over days, sometimes over months, that room gives way to a second, darker chamber, the chamber of rereading. This is where the real reckoning begins, and it is far more painful than the missing itself, because it is not about you at all anymore. It is about them. It is the mind going back over every conversation, every silence, every small withdrawal you offered as a signal, long before you offered the final one, and finding, to its horror, that the signs were everywhere, that you told them, that you told them in the way you stopped initiating, in the way your voice grew shorter on the phone, in the way you no longer fought for the last word, because you had quietly stopped believing the argument was worth having. And the mind, cruelly, will not let this rereading stop at one or two memories. It will drag them through the whole archive. It will show them, one by one, every door you tried, every hand you extended that closed on air. This is not punishment from you. You are not even in the room for this part. This is the psyche's own justice system, and it is far more thorough and far less merciful than anything you could have designed yourself. I have spent a great deal of my life studying what happens in the parts of the mind we do not choose to visit, the parts that operate whether we invite them or not, that keep their own records, run their own trials, deliver their own verdicts long after the conscious mind has moved on to other business. And if there is one thing I can tell you with certainty, it is this: nothing indicts a person so thoroughly as their own memory, once it is finally forced to stop performing and start remembering honestly. A person can lie to their friends. They can lie to a therapist, if they are skilled enough, for years. But they cannot, in the end, lie to the version of themselves that visits them at 3 in the morning, when the noise of the day has gone quiet, and there is nothing left to distract them from what they actually did. That is where the true reckoning happens, not in confrontation, not in argument, in the silence of a mind that finally has nowhere left to hide from itself. And here is where something remarkable begins to happen. Something I think is worth naming clearly, because it is easy to mistake it for something smaller than it is. What people are actually mourning when they lose someone who mattered is rarely only the other person. They are mourning the version of themselves that existed in relation to that person, the self that was known, that was witnessed, that did not have to explain its jokes or justify its silences because someone else had already learned its language. Losing you does not just mean losing your presence. It means losing the mirror in which a certain reflection of themselves used to appear. And when that mirror is gone, they are left, often for the first time in years, looking at themselves without an audience. This is unbearable for people who have spent their whole lives being witnessed rather than being alone with what they actually are. And so a great deal of what looks like longing for you is, if we are honest about it, a longing for the self they only knew how to be in your company, the self that felt easier, funnier, softer, more forgivable, because you were the one holding up the mirror. This is why loss cuts so much deeper than absence alone would explain. It is not simply that a person is gone from a life. It is that an entire identity, built quietly over months or years in the shared language of two people, has collapsed, and there is no replacing it, because identities like that are not manufactured. They are grown slowly, the way trees grow, by two root systems intertwining underground, long before anyone can see it above the surface. When you pull one tree out, you do not simply remove a tree. You tear roots that had wrapped themselves around the other tree's foundation, and the other tree feels it in places it did not know were connected. So what precisely do they feel? Once the disbelief thins out and the rereading has run its brutal course, let me name it honestly, because vague comfort helps no one, and you did not come to hear platitudes. They feel shame first, and shame is different from guilt in a way worth understanding. Guilt says, I did a bad thing. Shame says, I am a bad thing, or worse, I am the kind of person who could do this and not notice until it was too late. Shame is the deeper wound because it does not attack the action, it attacks the self that performed it, and there is no undoing an action that has already convicted the actor. This is why people who lose someone significant often go quiet in ways that look, from the outside, like sulking or indifference. It is not indifference, it is shame doing what shame always does, retreating, hiding, making itself small, because it cannot bear to be witnessed in this state by anyone, least of all by the version of themselves that used to believe they were someone worth choosing. Beneath the shame, they feel something even less comfortable to name: envy, envy of your ability to leave, because leaving, when it is done with clarity, is one of the rarest and most misunderstood acts a person can perform. Most people cannot do it. Most people stay in diminished things long past the point of dignity, because staying feels safer than the unbearable uncertainty of an empty room. When someone loses a person who left with real conviction, not in anger, not in a slammed door, but in the quiet, settled certainty of someone who has simply stopped waiting to be chosen, they are confronted with a version of strength they do not possess yet. And that confrontation is humbling in a way that very little else in life manages to be. They do not just miss you, they are forced to reckon with the fact that you did something they have never had the courage to do for themselves. You honored your own worth even when it cost you the very thing you wanted to keep. And beneath all of that, at the very bottom of the chamber, is the feeling that frightens people the most, the one they will spend the most energy avoiding. The recognition that they did this to themselves, not you, them. This is the feeling that no amount of blaming you, no amount of rewriting the story in their favor, no amount of telling their friends a version where you were unreasonable and they were patient can fully erase. Because underneath every self-protective story a person tells about a loss, there is a small, honest voice that knows exactly what happened. And that voice does not go away just because it has been shouted over. It waits. It is patient in a way grief itself is not. And it will speak again, usually in the quiet hours, usually when they are least prepared to hear it, and it will say the thing they have been running from since the day the door closed. I had something rare, and I treated it like it was permanent. And now I understand that nothing worth having was ever obligated to stay. I tell you all of this not to give you satisfaction, though I understand the temptation to feel something like justice in it. I tell you this because I want you to understand precisely what you are worth and precisely what it costs another person to lose you, so that you never again mistake someone's comfort in your presence for their appreciation of it. Comfort and appreciation are not the same thing, and this is one of the great confusions of human intimacy. A person can be extremely comfortable with you and simultaneously blind to you, the way a man is comfortable in a house he has lived in for 20 years and has stopped noticing the view from its windows. It is only when the house is sold, when he stands outside it in the rain with his belongings in boxes, that the view returns to him in its full, unbearable clarity. Every window, every room, every morning light he walked past 1,000 times without once stopping to receive it. You must understand something about the architecture of the human mind, because it explains almost everything about why people fail to value what they have until the exact moment they no longer have it. The mind is built to notice change, not steadiness. It is built by long evolutionary necessity to respond to what moves, what threatens, what is new, and it is built to stop noticing what remains constant, because constancy, to the ancient machinery of the brain, reads as safety. and safety does not require vigilance. This is not a moral failing in most people. It is a design flaw in the instrument through which they experience the world. But, and this is the part that matters, the fact that it is not entirely their fault does not mean it costs them nothing. The mind's blindness to what is steady is precisely why steady, devoted people are so often the ones who go unappreciated until they finally, quietly stop being steady. The tragedy is not that people are cruel. Most people who lose someone valuable were not cruel to them. The tragedy is that they were unconscious, and unconsciousness in matters of the heart does exactly as much damage as cruelty, while feeling from the inside like nothing at all. This is why I want to speak now not only about what the other person feels, but about what it means for you, because there is a very real danger when you understand how deeply someone will eventually feel your absence of building your sense of worth entirely around the fantasy of their future regret. I want to warn you plainly against this because it is one of the most common and most corrosive traps a person can fall into after walking away from someone who failed to value them. It feels in the early days almost like justice, the thought that somewhere out there they are lying awake, replaying every mistake, finally understanding what they lost. And there may be truth in that thought. Everything I have said tonight suggests there probably is. But if you make their eventual regret the point of your leaving, if the quiet engine driving your peace is the hope that they will suffer for what they did, you have not actually left them. You have simply changed the terms of your attachment. You have traded the hope of their love for the hope of their remorse, and both of those are still hooks, still lines running back into a life you are supposed to be walking away from. Real freedom does not need their regret to validate it. Real freedom is indifferent to whether they ever feel a thing at all, because it has stopped organizing itself around their reactions altogether. This is the deeper work, and it is the part of tonight's speech I most want you to carry with you, because it is not really about them anymore. It is about the extraordinary, uncomfortable, necessary process of becoming a person who does not need to be missed in order to know their own worth. Most people spend their entire lives waiting for external proof that they matter, a promotion, a compliment, a person who finally sees them the way they have always wanted to be seen. And there is nothing wrong with wanting to be seen. It is one of the oldest and most legitimate hungers a human being carries. But there is a vast, life-altering difference between wanting to be seen and needing to be seen in order to believe you exist. The first is human. The second is a quiet form of exile from yourself and no one else's eventual grief, however sincere, however overdue, will ever be able to fill that particular hole. Only you can do that. And the doing of it, make no mistake, is the loneliest and most important work most of us will ever undertake, because it requires sitting with yourself in the very silence that once terrified you, the silence you used to fill with someone else's attention, and discovering, often for the first time, that you can survive it, that you are in fact still there, still whole, even when no one else is in the room to confirm it. I want you to understand something about endings, because our culture tells a very simplified story about them, and simplified stories are almost always lies dressed up as comfort. We are taught that an ending is a wound, a subtraction, something done to us that leaves us smaller than we were. And sometimes it is. But there is another kind of ending, the kind we are speaking of tonight, in which the person who leaves is not diminished by the leaving. They are, for the first time in a long while, restored by it. Because staying in a place where you are unseen does not preserve you. It erodes you slowly, the way water erodes stone, so gradually that you do not notice the shape of yourself changing, until one day you look in the mirror and do not entirely recognize the tired, smaller thing looking back. Leaving, when it is the right leaving, is not the wound. Staying was the wound. Leaving is simply the moment the bleeding stops. There is an old and very human tendency to believe that if we stay long enough, love hard enough, endure enough silence and neglect with a patient smile, the other person will eventually wake up and see us the way we have always wanted to be seen. I want to say something to you that may be difficult to hear, but which I believe, with everything I have learned about the human psyche, to be true. People do not wake up because you suffered beautifully in front of them. They wake up when the person they were neglecting is finally gone, and the silence that follows is loud enough to reach them. Your suffering, offered as an invitation, rarely works. Your absence, offered as a fact, almost always does. Not because absence is a manipulation, but because absence is the only teacher that does not lie. Everything else can be argued with. Absence cannot. It simply is, and the mind, faced with something it cannot argue with, is finally forced to feel what it spent so long avoiding. So let us return once more to that person sitting alone in the room that used to feel full, because I do not want you to think of them only as a case study in regret. I want you to understand what happens to them afterward, over the longer arc of time, because this too is instructive, and it says something important about what you should never again accept from anyone who claims to value you. In the weeks that follow, if they are honest, and not everyone is capable of this kind of honesty, so I say, if deliberately, they will begin to understand that grief for a person is also quietly an education about themselves. They will notice the specific shape of what they miss, not you in the abstract, but the very particular things. The way you used to ask about their day and actually wait for the answer. The way you remembered the small things they mentioned once, in passing, months before, and brought them up again as proof that they had been truly heard. The steadiness of you, which they mistook for guarantee, and which they now understand, was never a guarantee at all. It was a gift freely given that could be and was withdrawn. And in noticing these specific things, they will begin, slowly, painfully, imperfectly, to understand the difference between being loved and being cared for in the deep, attentive way that requires real effort, real presence, real choosing, again and again, on ordinary days when nothing forces the choosing to happen. This is, if you will allow me the word, an initiation. It is not comfortable, and it should not be comfortable, because comfort was precisely the thing that allowed them to stop paying attention in the first place. What they are being initiated into is a harder, more honest way of loving, one that does not assume, does not coast, does not mistake someone's patience for an infinite resource. Some people complete this initiation and become genuinely better companions to whoever comes after you, more attentive, less complacent, more awake to the quiet signals they once ignored. This is not a comforting thought if you were hoping they would simply suffer forever, but I think it is, in the end, the more honest and more important truth. Pain that teaches nothing is only pain. Pain that transforms a person is, however harsh the phrase sounds, a kind of mercy, even when it does not feel like mercy to the one enduring it. But, and I want to be honest with you about this too, because false comfort is not the purpose of tonight. Not everyone completes the initiation. Some people simply grieve, learn nothing, and go looking for the next person to be comfortable with, repeating the same unconsciousness in a different room with a different face across from them. This is one of the hardest truths to accept about human nature. Insight is available to everyone, but it is not guaranteed to anyone. The door to self-knowledge stands open for all of us at the exact moment loss forces us to look through it. But walking through that door requires a kind of courage that many people simply do not have or have not yet developed. You cannot control which kind of person you have left behind, the kind who transforms or the kind who merely repeats. And here is the important part, the part I most want you to hold on to. It does not matter which kind they turn out to be. Your worth was never contingent on their capacity for growth. You are not responsible for whether the lesson lands. You already gave them everything a person could reasonably be asked to give. Your time, your attention, your patience, your presence, and what they do with the absence you have left behind is now entirely and only their business, not yours. I want to speak now more directly to the part of you that is still standing in the doorway of an ending, unsure whether you did the right thing, wondering if perhaps you were too harsh, too final, too quick to walk away from something that might have changed if you had only waited a little longer. This uncertainty is natural. It is, in fact, a sign that you are a person capable of real love, because only people capable of real love doubt themselves this way. The ones who never loved deeply enough to be afraid of losing something rarely doubt anything at all. But I want to offer you a way of thinking about this doubt that may help settle it. Ask yourself honestly, did you leave the moment something went wrong? Or did you leave after a long, quiet pattern of being unseen despite every reasonable signal you gave? If it is the latter, and for most people reckoning with a loss significant enough to bring them to a speech like this one, it almost always is, then you did not act too quickly. You very likely acted too slowly, the way most of us do, because leaving is hard, and the mind will always find 100 reasons to delay a necessary ending in favor of one more chance, one more conversation, one more attempt to be understood by someone who has already shown you repeatedly that understanding you is not currently within their capacity. This brings me to something I think is essential, and which I want to state as plainly as I can. The fact that someone will eventually feel the full weight of losing you is not a reason to stay long enough for them to feel it before you go. Waiting to be missed is its own kind of self-abandonment, dressed up as patience. If you find yourself lingering in a diminished thing because you believe somewhere beneath the surface that your leaving will finally make them understand, you are still in that moment, organizing your life around their awareness rather than your own well-being. And that is precisely the pattern that needed to end. The healthiest version of leaving is the one that happens because staying no longer serves you, full stop, regardless of whether the other person ever comes to understand what they lost. Their eventual grief, if it comes, is not the reward for your leaving. Your own restored peace is the reward. Everything else is simply what happens afterward, in a life that is no longer yours to manage. I want to close now with something about time, because time is the great unacknowledged force in every story of loss and realization, and I think it deserves to be named directly. We live in an age that wants everything immediately, immediate answers, immediate reconciliation, immediate proof that our worth has been recognized. But the psyche does not move on the timeline of a message left on read. The psyche moves slowly, the way glaciers move, the way roots grow underground, long before anything visible appears above the soil. If someone has lost you, and they are the kind of person capable of real reckoning, that reckoning may not arrive in the tidy, satisfying shape you might once have wished for. It may arrive in fragments over years, a song that catches them off guard in a grocery store, a joke they almost make, and then remember there is no one left to make it to, a moment of unexpected clarity at 3 in the morning, long after you have stopped checking whether they've noticed at all. You may never see this reckoning. You are not entitled to see it, and I want to release you from any lingering hope that you are owed a front row seat to someone else's growth. Let it be enough, simply, that it is happening somewhere, in a room you will never enter again, without needing your presence to witness it, without needing anything more from you than the gift you already gave, and the absence you were finally brave enough to leave in its place. So, let this be what you carry out of this room tonight into whatever ordinary evening is waiting for you beyond these walls. You are not required to stay somewhere in order to be understood. You are not required to shrink yourself into a shape someone else finds comfortable in order to be kept. You are not required to wait, patient and diminishing, for a person to develop the consciousness necessary to see you, when the truest, kindest, most dignified thing you can do for yourself and eventually, strangely, for them is simply to become unavailable to that particular blindness. Let your absence be the education you were too generous for too long to make them earn any other way. Let it be quiet, let it be complete, and let yourself at last stop performing your worth for an audience that stopped watching long before you noticed the seats were empty, and start living instead as the person you always were beneath the waiting, whole, sufficient, and finally fully your own. That is what people feel when they realize they have lost you. And more importantly, that is what you are allowed to become the moment you stop needing them to feel it in order to know it was true all along.